Hello. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about value theory, namely what gives things value. And this is a big idea in economics, and it's one that's been controversial and discussed for hundreds and hundreds of years. The historical, what we might call classical view of value came from Adam Smith. And of course, we've talked a lot about Adam Smith, this term. The idea that Smith had was that labor gave things value. So if it took you a long time to build a barn and it took a lot of labor to do that, labor to find the wood and prepare the wood and labor to haul the wood, and then subsequently labor to build the barn, ultimately the barn's price and the value of that barn would be connected to the amount of labor that was used up to produce it. That theory had a lot of traction in the history of economics. Many of you know about Karl Marx. He was a major proponent of the labor theory of value. He wrote in the middle part of the 19th century, around 1850 or so. And again, between Smith in 1776 and Marx in the middle part of the 19th century, that 75-year period was characterized by a strong belief in the labor theory of value. Shortly after the Civil War, around the time of the Civil War, a new idea was taking hold in economics, and it was called the marginal theory. And it gave rise to the marginalist revolution. It was basically three European economists, Leon Walras, William Stanley Jevons, and Carl Menger, three economists that were working pretty much independently, even writing in different languages. We're working on the problem of value in the 1860s and the 1870s. And in 1871, we sort of solved the the marginal revolution took hold, and the problem of value theory had been changed in a substantial way. What we got to in the marginalist era was a notion that every unit has a little bit different value. And if you think of a Coca-Cola, for example, under the labor theory of value, if it took a lot of labor to make a Coke, then that would be the cost of it and subsequently the price of a Coke. But under the marginalist notion, the value of a Coke wasn't fixed. The value of a Coke was dependent upon how many others you had. So if your father worked in a Coca-Cola factory and brought home cases every week, then perhaps those Cokes wouldn't have very much value to you because you've got so many that having another one or two around the house is not a big deal. On the other hand, if you had none and you hadn't had a Coke for several months because you were on a island or something like that, then all of a sudden that first Coke is going to taste absolutely great. So the notion was that the more we have of something, the less an additional unit is valued. And that's what the margin is all about. If we think about why economists love this idea of the margin's what? Well, it's the edge. It's that little bit extra that we get or that we give up when we get another unit or have a unit taken away from us. So the marginalists focused on that idea. And underlying their analysis was the question, how many of these do you already have, and how much more will one additional unit mean to you? Well, that's sort of the marginal piece of it. Another thing that we have to look at is another idea that was popular in the 1900s or the 1800s, and that was the utilitarian notion. And the utilitarians were also Europeans that wrote in the 1800s. And they developed this notion that we could measure value based upon the utility that it gave somebody to own or to consume a particular product. So again, if you eat a hot dog, it gives you satisfaction. And the utilitarians concocted a word for that. They called it utility. And they said this thing, this hot dog, gives you a certain amount of utility. And we can shorten that to utils, and utils is going to be the unit of measurement that we attach to how much satisfaction you received from that particular hot dog. Now, understand utility doesn't necessarily mean that you like something. Oftentimes you get utility from things that you don't particularly want to do. For example, go to the dentist and get your teeth cleaned. You get utility from that, but you might think, well, I really didn't want to do that, but it's something that I had to do. Nevertheless, you purchase that, it has value to you, and that's the notion of utility. So as we think about how these ideas come together, the utility notion merged in with the marginal notion, that gets us to this idea in consumer behavior that the consumer is motivated by this sense of utility, and his appreciation or measurement of utility is contingent upon how many units he or she already has. That gives rise to two final ideas I'll talk about today. One is the total utility function. Total utility is how much you get from successive consumption of the same thing. So again, if you have one hamburger and then two hamburgers and then three hamburgers all in succession, we can think that each one of those gives utility to you, but we probably think that you get a diminishing marginal utility there because each subsequent hamburger that you eat doesn't give you quite as much utility as the first one. So the total utility function would be increasing at a decreasing rate if we put quantity of hamburgers on the horizontal axis and we put total utility on the vertical axis. And so by looking at the rate of change of that total utility function, we can get the idea of the marginal utility. And the marginal utility is the extra utility that you get from subsequent units of something. So your first unit may have given you 100 utils, your second unit 60 utils, and your third unit 30 utils. Well, there's 190 total, but every one of those hamburgers gave you just a little bit different satisfaction based upon the number that you've already eaten. So as you're looking through the utility literature of this chapter, make sure that you disentangle those ideas of total utility and marginal utility, understanding that the margin is what's really important to us here, because that really determines when a consumer stops buying or how much satisfaction they get from that final unit.